his last name, so I'm going to ask you now. How is it?
Gaillard.
Gaillard?
Gaillard.
Gaillard?
Yeah.
So, okay. And so thank you for that. And so JC is actually live streaming right now with us from New Zealand, where he lives. But is that where are you originally from New Zealand?
No, I was born and grew up in France.
Where is that?
In France.
Oh, France. Sorry, France,
Yeah,
France,
yeah,
France. Okay, okay.
yeah. As my accent probably suggests, although it's a mix of a bit of everything, but yeah, no. I
Yeah.
hold a New Zealand passport now, but I've got, yeah, still my French citizenship.
Yes, I was going to say French, very, very different than our Quebec
Indeed,
accents here. It's
indeed.
quite noticeable. So that's cool. So you've written a book. Is this your first book, or is this another one for you?
It's another one.
It's another one. So this one is The Invention of Disaster. And what really caught my eye about it is the fact that you look at it from a post-colonial sort of view. You have a view on it because I don't know much about you, and I kind of was able to get into a little bit of the book from what's online. But are you looking at this from an Indigenous perspective in New Zealand? Or when you say post-colonial, what does that mean to you?
No, it's more a theoretical critique of the field of disaster studies and how it has influenced policies and action towards reducing the risk of disasters in the end. So it's more a critique of the system from within
Okay.
than an exploration of what disasters may be from other perspectives. This is going to be for the sequel of the book
Oh,
coming up in some years. I don't want to give any
oh, there's going to be
any
a
clear
sequel.
time frame.
Okay. And
Yes, hopefully that's the plan.
what led you to writing about the invention of disaster? Because I know you talk a little bit in it about where the title came from. It was taken from I think it's the invention of Africa
Yeah.
and yeah, and so what kind of inspired you, and maybe too, how does that tie in with your background and what you do in New Zealand?
So I'm a geographer by training, and I live in New Zealand, but I spent most of the past 25 years in the Philippines actually. So my
Okay.
life is split between the three countries, basically France, Philippines, and New Zealand. And most of my research, as well as my practical work towards reducing the risk of disasters with NGOs and local government agencies, has been in the Philippines for the past 25 years. And the book grew out of frustration, I
Hmm.
think. And the frustration I felt when both doing research and trying to do work with NGOs and local government agencies, and trying to impose concepts and methods and understandings of disasters that weren't matching what people were kind of experiencing and telling me. And I think I've tried to apply these concepts and methods and understandings of disasters for the past 20 years again. And and over the past 5 years, I started to feel that really something was not correct. There were some challenges that were unspoken somehow in the field, and the frustration at that point was not enough for me to write an entire book. And it's only when I got the opportunity to publish a short commission paper for the journal Disasters to celebrate its 40-year anniversary in 2019. So I wrote a short paper in 2018, which was a pain to write. I spent ages trying to pull together 3,000 words. But this paper, which was kind of a short reflection on the field, got a bit of traction. And it got a bit of traction, especially among young researchers and early career scholars. And especially, I gave a few gigs in Europe in 2019, And I got a lot of early career scholars and PhD students coming to me and say, yes, this is what we feel as well, and this is what we need to engage with. And that gave me hope.
Mm.
So on top of the frustration, there was now hope, and that's that hope that became the sort of driver for me to write that book. So that was that was really some sort of toothpaste or ketchup writing afterwards. When I was on sabbatical leave a couple of years ago, I just wrote 80,000 words out of the blue in a few months, which I never thought I would be able to write.
Yeah.
But it came as a burst somehow, and that's why there are flaws in the book, I know. But I'm happy with the argument overall, I think.
Yeah, and what I really like I love the fact that you go into like gender in disasters, for one thing, and you call it, I don't know if is this a formal act, is governmentality of, like, is that from somewhere, or is that something that you've coined? Governmentality.
No, that's the term that Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, pitched in the late 1970s, second
Okay.
half of the 70s,
I've never
basically
heard it
to
before.
describe.
Yeah.
It's meant to describe the modern form of government that emerged in Europe in the late 18th and then 19th century, and the form of government associated then with liberalism. And I think that it's been expanded to environmentality, for example, by some other scholars since then.
Okay.
But I think it makes sense in the context of the post-colonial, but as well post-structuralist or postmodern argument of the book, to provide a critique of the system
Yes.
of government or governance, depending on how we use these terms, and how they've been applied to reducing the risk of disasters.
Yeah, and so maybe let's start with the gender and disaster, and give us a little bit of just a summary on what you talk about, or what you present in the book around gender and disaster, because you go beyond men and women, and that's, I think, really important coming into this next decade, as we see across the world this flourishing of the gender spectrum, and this greater awareness that it's just not a binary world. And so how do you present that in this book in terms of disasters?
I think that the chapter on gender, which is chapter 8, if I'm wrong.
Yes, chapter 8, yep.
Similarly to the overall argument of the book, stems from frustration in practice. And so since 2007, 2008, we've been doing a lot of practical work again with NGOs in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. And consistently, we were working with people who claim an identity beyond the male/man, female/woman binary.
Yeah.
And these people we're kind of falling between the cracks of both academic research and actions and policies for reducing the risk of disasters. And it was obvious at the time that they were contributing a lot, and they are contributing a lot to reducing the risk of disasters on the ground by doing very simple things that they do in everyday life, but that they extend in time of disasters. And these things challenge the binary, and challenge the tasks we assume to be those of men or women in Philippine society, for example. They have that kind of liminal ability to kind of swing from what women and men do. They can do everything basically in the community, and that proves super useful and super exciting from a practical perspective to harness for reducing the risk of disasters. But at the time, there was no research on the topic, and except for some isolated studies from India especially. And there was nothing in policy or actions as well. Mm. So we started then to make some noise through my friends of the Gender and Disaster Network through local NGOs. And I remember it was kind of a struggle at the start. At the time, back in 2008, I was still an academic in France, and I remember my colleagues laughing about me when I was talking about doing research on gender beyond the binary in the context of disasters. I
Sure.
promise, it's true
Yeah.
story. And I remember the Gender and Disaster Network as well, mailing list, which comprises, I think, 3,000 plus members.
Yeah.
But we received some very harsh comments suggesting that if we engage beyond the binary, we would undermine the advocacy for women, which is absolutely not the case. We are
Yeah.
still advocating for all gender identities to be given the attention they deserve. So it's been a struggle, but now I think after 15 years, I think we've gained some ground, because now there's a significant community of researchers working in that space.
Yeah.
UNDRR has recently invited my colleague Kevin Blanchard, who's British, but he's one of the.
Oh, he's the no natural disasters.
He is,
Yes,
and
one of
He's been
yes.
invited to join one of the UNDRR advisory board to
Okay.
advocate for those kind of issues. So we've gained recognition.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think it's yeah, you were probably cutting edge 14 years ago talking about gender and disasters and yes, the recognition. And I mean, I don't know a lot about the Philippines, but I would imagine that at that time, yeah, having that understanding that women and men can sort of reverse roles in the traditional sense during a disaster, during recovery, would that yeah, that's like doubling your resources in a way in some areas. So yeah, that's really neat. What tell us a little bit about before we go into the book, like you were in the Philippines for 20 years? Is that
No, I
right?
think in total maybe it should be 13 years back and
13.
forth. But I spent some years teaching there full time for the university, state university, the big state university.
And so what was it like being there? And I don't know if when you were there what they had in terms of major if they had any significant events. I don't know if there was. What did you experience there
Yeah,
in
I mean,
Philippines?
I regularly experienced typhoons and large
Yeah.
scale flooding and some earthquakes, one of 6.9 and two of 6.1. But that was kind of routine somehow. It was an
Right.
impediment because I had to travel 2 hours to get to the uni. So I used always to have some, how do you call that in Canada? We call these jandals in New Zealand, sandals,
Sandals. Okay,
in my
sandals. Yep.
bag just to make sure that, yeah, I could go through,
Wow.
flooded areas going to work. But that was kind of standard, routine kind of practice. Um, but the country, yeah, has been affected by very large scale disasters. Let's call these disasters over the past 30 years. And my PhD was on the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991 in the first place.
Okay.
Um, but I think, I mean, the Philippines is considered as one of the most progressive countries when it comes to reducing the risk of disasters. The legal instrument we have, and that
Yeah.
dates back to 2010, is considered one of the most progressive in the world on paper. There are challenges on the ground.
Yeah.
The NGOs are, for many of them, considered as pioneers of what we usually call community-based disaster risk reduction back in the
Yeah.
1980s.
Yeah.
1980s, 1990s. So there's a strong field, and now you can find colleagues from the Philippines a bit everywhere in the world when it comes to disasters, whether it's academics or working for, I'm not sure, the World Bank, the UN, NGOs, networks of NGOs. Yeah, there's a strong network and a strong experience in that field.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's something I'm gonna have to look into a little bit because I know, I think like countries like Canada, I mean, we have access to the UN and what's come out of the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Office, and everything that they've done over the last 60, 70 years to progress to where they are today in terms of strategies and frameworks. But still, in Canada being the country we are, much like Australia, New Zealand, maybe the States, we tend to still develop in our own rate with not as much reliant on the UN, where I think I kind of see other countries like the Philippines, Africa, they really access the UN and the research and the tools, which I think are way, in a lot of ways, way ahead of what we do in Canada. We just kind of, I don't know, we kind of, we acknowledge the UN and the work they do and the Sendai framework and all this stuff, but there doesn't seem to be at the local level a significant use of that knowledge or tools or information. And it's, is that like, is that a fair observation?
Yeah,
From your
I mean,
perspective?
yeah, probably. I mean, it's not, I mean, that I'm supporting the UN and its work in the book, but I think that's a fair assessment of the situation. I think it's a bit different for New Zealand
Yeah,
because for, I would say some sort of, geopolitical reasons, um, the New Zealand government picked up on the Sendai framework very quickly and has been very proactive, for example, in terms of submitting its reports to the UN when these reports are due, to play some sort of diplomatic game, because the country being so small,
yeah,
it rises to prominence in the field of disasters because it's known for being a place of good practices and with a very strong experience in that field, both for science and policy.
yeah.
So it has played, it's played that game in terms of geopolitical prominence. And it wasn't the case prior to the Sendai framework. No one knew here about the Yogo framework for action prior to 2015, for example. But
Okay.
since then, the Sendai framework's been used everywhere, which is interesting.
Yeah, it has, and that's something I notice a lot in the UN. And I'll get back to your book, I promise. But I love, you know, I appreciate talking to you. Someone who's outside of North America. You're in New
And who
Zealand.
knows nothing about North America as well.
Yeah, okay, great. And I know I don't know a lot about Europe, European disaster risk reduction, what they're doing in Europe. I don't know a lot. I don't know a lot about the Philippines. I lived in Australia for a year, and I know Australia. You're not New Zealand. There's a difference. I get it. Don't worry. But you know, I've been close to that culture. And while there's a lot of similarities, there's a lot of differences. So I when I get the opportunity to talk to someone that has a totally different global view, I kind of like to quiz them on, you know, how
Fair
they
enough.
see a lot of this stuff going on.
And
Um,
I think there are more similarities between New Zealand and Canada than between
yes,
Australia and Canada.
yes,
Uh, Especially, I think the two countries are stepping up in terms of the consideration of indigenous
yes.
people and rights, and they are Kiwi researchers in Canada working for Canadian universities, and I've got many colleagues who spend their sabbatical in Canada because it's a conducive
Okay.
environment for us.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And we've got now three universities that offer masters and degree in disaster management, which is great. It's growing. Just a lot of them can't get work, unfortunately, because it's, you know, it's the field is there's not a lot of money in it yet. So yeah, let's kind of go hop back into your book a little bit, because I also the quest for is it, I forget how to say it now,
Yes.
panometry. Can you explain that a little bit? Because I had to look it up and just get a basic understanding of what it was. But can you just walk us through that? Because I love this concept.
I think the overall argument of the book is to challenge any universal truth when it
Yeah,
comes to what a disaster is and how it applies to all over the world. And that's one of the starting point, I think, at the first sentence of the preface of the book, which
yes,
is that we all now kind of consider that disasters are social construct. But at the same time, we use concepts, we use methods, we use frameworks that we take for universal and roll out all over the world across very different societies and culture, and assume that they will help us make sense of disasters. And this is supported by this sort of universal quest for metrics and numbers and ways to appraise what a disaster might be. So when I use pantometry, it's to capture that kind of obsessional quest for universal truth, something that we can actually not only measure, but kind of make tangible in a way or in another. And to me, this is a problem because there are many probably other ways of understanding what we call disasters might be elsewhere in the world, and that might be by going beyond just numbers, just beyond sight. That's why I used the word senses at some point, based on the work of a Nigerian sociologist. We could make use of, I'm not sure, of sounds, of touch, of other senses that may help us understand the world in a very different way.
Yeah, that's interesting because when you experience a disaster, it is not just about the damage. There, like in Canada right now, in BC, British Columbia, where we had the wildfires, really horrible wildfires over the summer. A town burnt down, an entire town, Lytton, BC, which was then followed by a fall of the worst flooding we've ever seen in Canadian history. And there is this obsession to try and measure these things, but there's the mental health aspects of what's going on right now. There's the loss of just landmarks that were all through BC that are no longer going to be accessible. That grieving and that loss, like you can't measure that easily or at all. It's hard to quantify. And so is that kind of where you're coming from in that frustration or that idea?
Yeah. Definitely, that's part of it.
Okay, part of
Definitely.
it, yeah.
But
Okay.
I think, I mean, when we talk about a disaster, we probably now often unconsciously draw a line between what's acceptable
Yeah.
and what's not. The D's in the aster, right? Very
Yeah.
much like we draw a line, or we identify a threshold in mental disorder, or in
Yeah.
a disease, we draw a line, right? I mean, in terms
Yeah.
of medicine, you draw a line in terms of your physiological parameters between what is normal and what is a disease. And it's the very same thing in time of disaster. You draw a line between what's considered acceptable or normal life and what becomes too much, and too much damage, too much impact, too much suffering. And when then the process, the event becomes a disaster. It's the very same process, but there's no absolute truth, right? I mean, the list of disease of the World Health Organization changes all the time. The DSM manual of the mental health practitioners, psychiatrists, or psychologists changes all the time. I'm not sure, there may be 6th or 7th edition now.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Yeah.
so there's no single truth, right? There's no thing that we can for sure label a disaster. It's always subjective. And my concern is who draws the line.
Mm,
And who draws the line for whom. It's
right.
usually not those who suffer, because in the book, I'm not challenging hardship and suffering. Far from me. This is the starting point of the argument. I'm challenging who draws the line between what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and who defines what a disaster is and what a disaster is not.
Yeah, and and I think, it's about giving the communities the tools to draw that line for themselves a little bit, right?
Absolutely.
Right, a community, like a household, a community, a province, a state, a territory, a country, the world. Yeah, it's not actually, it kind of, when you said that, it makes, here in the city where I live in Alberta, in Edmonton, at the public swimming pools, they they would always say, don't go into deep water. Stay out of deep water. Well, JC, if I were to ask you what is deep water, I mean, what would you say versus me or my grandmother or my 6-year-old? So they put out cardboard cutouts of a child, a parent, a senior citizen, all these different body types, and they said deep water is at your shoulder length,
Interesting.
right? And so right there, I was like, what a great way to empower people to assess their own risk for deep water. So it always makes me think about disasters. What kind of tools can you give a community or a country to say, here's what a disaster is for you, assess it, and yeah, is it a disaster? Maybe it's not yet, or who knows?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
yeah, that's an interesting argument. And so you've been in this field for all of your career?
Yes, for 2020. I started my master's in 1995, 1996.
95. And so there, and that was in France? Was that in France?
Yeah, yeah, it was in France, in
It was in
Grenoble.
France. And so at that time, like what was the education landscape like for disaster management, disaster risk reduction? Was it like did you look at different countries? Did you stay in France because that was home? What was it like then?
My master's was based in my hometown in France, in the French Alps, which
Okay.
was at the time considered the sort of mecca of
Yeah.
natural hazards. But then I had the opportunity to do an internship with very small consultancy firm led by my former supervisor, and then we started to explore opportunities overseas because there were many researchers in Grenoble and around Grenoble who were doing or who had done research in Latin America. At the time, the main area for doing research and the very kind of progressive region was Latin America, with the emergence of the network La Red as well
Okay.
in 1992. So it was really the place to go and to visit for doing research, but as well for learning from the local researchers and practitioners. So at the time, I was lined up to do some research in Colombia for my PhD, but I didn't speak any word of Spanish then, but
Mm-hmm.
it was interesting. But an opportunity occurred a bit out of the blue because of a corridor encounter between two people. And there was this opportunity to do research in the Philippines, and I jumped on this, and it happened to be my life afterwards because I stayed there, I
Yeah.
worked there before I returned to France in 2005. So at the time, geography was very prominent in France in that space, and I was studying geography, but there weren't any dedicated programs back then. I think the
Yeah.
first in France may have emerged in possibly the early 2000s or something.
Okay. 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 Interesting. Yeah, I like again, it's that history, right? And part of these conversations are for people that are just finishing their masters right now and they're in their mid 20s. To kind of, have access to someone like you who did their education, yeah, coming up 25, 30 years ago. It's important that they kind of hear, the progression of the field over the last couple of decades, because we always seem to focus on the last disaster, right? That's always a common thing. And so to kind of get that perspective of someone who's been in the field for a while, I imagine you've seen a lot of change, and that frustration you speak about is from decades of research and seeing probably patterns and systems just cycle over and over and over without much change,
Yeah, I
right?
think you're raising a very good point here. I haven't witnessed that much change over the years, and that's a very important issue. I think. I mean, our field is very well known for rehashing the same things again and again and again,
Yeah.
and being under theorized as well. And as a side note, a colleague of mine and of some friends um, just came up with a series of video interviews with pioneers of disaster risk reduction and
Oh
disaster
yeah.
study that
Okay.
are all available from the UN DRR YouTube
Okay.
channel. I can share that with you afterwards if you wish. So
Yeah.
there are 12 or 15 at the moment available, and there are 12 or 15 more to come soon.
Okay.
So it's basically 40, 50 years of history. And I agree with you. I mean, 100% that we need to learn from these pioneers. I mean, just not to rehash what we've been doing for the past 40, 50 years and just focus on the last disaster, as you said. And as well to be thoughtful of what we claim to be our inspirations, because
Yes.
one of the points I'm trying to make in the book is that the concept of vulnerability that we all take for granted now, um, to me, never was what it's been since then. It never was a silver bullet solution to understand people's experiences all around the world. It was just a prompt to
Mm.
emphasize the social dimension of disasters. It was never meant to be rolled out all over the world, because you can't even translate the word in most languages in the world.
Yes.
Um, so we need to be learning from the past to be thoughtful to what we think are our key concepts, because we are making some wrong decisions somehow.
Well, yeah, we've made wrong decisions, and I think organizations through the pandemic have been in flux these last 2 years in terms of being able to make decisions because their workforce is now scattered all at home. People are now just trying to figure out how to go back to work again. And while that's all happening, while that is all happening, we're still trying to make decisions. And I think, yeah, the decision making around right now in a lot of areas is not as good as it was even 2 years ago. I think it's gotten worse, but that's a whole different conversation. Um, so, like, if you were, you know, I know you're starting to talk a little bit more about your books, but what's the one key takeaway from the invention of disaster that you really want maybe the new generation coming up to kind of consider and think about as you look over your career and write and continue on to your second book? What's that one nugget that you really just, if you can nail it down to one or two, maybe two?
Don't take anything for granted.
Yeah,
There's no common sense.
yeah,
I mean, the whole argument of the book is to basically show that disaster studies is dominated by Western science, knowledge, understandings of the world, and this knowledge has informed very normative policies and actions for disaster risk reduction that may or may not fit the local context where they've been applied. So my suggestion and my take is from here, try to explore other epistemologies, other ways of knowing the world, other world views or world senses, starting with probably local languages, which to me are the key entry points, the probably most tangible entry points, to challenge what we believe disasters are, and how people deal with them.
so get up from behind the desk. Go talk to the indigenous communities in your area. Maybe even try to explore the world a little bit and take that larger global view. Because and is that at all? I mean, that would have been valuable advice like any time in the last 2-3 thousand years. But do you think that is even more important now as we're going through what climate scientists will say? We are in the middle of a climate crisis right now. It's not that it's upon us. We've been in it for a long time now. And so it's even
Yeah,
more
so I'm
important.
I'm not saying in the book that we should throw all these concepts out of the window
No.
altogether.
Yeah.
Uh, it just to always challenge them, to contextualize them, to always contest their meanings and applications, uh, and to confront them to other world senses.
Yeah.
And this is very much important because and I think the book has been kind of there have been some misunderstanding about it. I'm not trying to essentialize otherness and other views and indigenous perspectives, because we know it's mostly hybrid now.
Yeah.
Um, so we need Western concepts. We need to challenge them, to contest them. And the same thing for climate change. I mean, it's a very normative space. Obviously, climate change is a very important issue, and we need to focus on it. And that's why, I mean, we need to focus on how people on the ground deal with those changes in the climate and how they perceive them, because it's hard to apply a single, again, threshold or a single norm about what climate change may mean for people in northern Canada, or in Australia, or in the Philippines, or in Uganda, or wherever. I mean, my concern is really kind of challenging universal perspectives, and
Yeah.
assuming that there's only one truth about everything. That's a very post-structuralist, postmodern kind of perspective, and I think this is important in
Yeah,
nowadays.
and just from again not having read your book in the entirety, because I couldn't, I don't think I was able, I couldn't get my hands on it, and then of course my house flooded, and then I had COVID, so I've not been really doing too much. But from the preview that I've read of it, that's available at I think it's at
Yeah,
routledge.com.
yeah,
It yeah, it you I think you state in that preview that this is not about saying Western science is all bad or all good, and it's not. It's trying to use all of the systems and all of the knowledge and all of the perspectives that are out there to continue to progress. Which I've got a good friend here in Alberta. He's a First Nations emergency manager at a First Nations here in Alberta, and he's of the same view. He relies on a lot on his elders to guide him in understanding, what's happened to the land over the last few thousand years, and to look back at how they didn't really have disasters then. It was, he literally would they would literally tell stories about how they would, use beavers to create dams to stop flooding as some of that mitigation. And he's not looking to abandon Western practices. He's trying to sort of develop strategies where old indigenous ways or traditional indigenous ways make sense and can fold in with Western science and Western ways. So I think that's exactly what you're saying. And then also with that, um, I lost my train of thought for a second, but it was along the same lines of, yeah, that trying to coalesce things and not be binary, kind of even to what you were talking about the gender piece, right? Is it's not one or the other.
yeah. It's not black and white. It's not
Yeah.
the West against the other. It's diversity. It's looking at
Yes.
things in their diversity and hybridity as well. So now I kind of regret somehow that I could have added a chapter on the hybrid dimension of how people make sense of their environment. But it's too late now, and it's going to be in the sequel. It's going to be the main pitch of the sequel. But I think, yeah, I mean, I know some people started to wonder if I were essentializing the others as some sort of isolated, pure
Yeah.
societies. No, I'm not saying that at all.
But I think, and that's just not, I think that naturally just comes from also people, starting to process this idea that we're challenging Western ways of doing things. We're challenging, colonization. We're challenging how we came upon in Canada and colonized and settled on First Nation land. Like we're doing a lot of that in Canada right now. through truth and reconciliation, and finding massive grave sites at residential schools where the government's, basically kidnapped. It's called the 60s scoop. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the Canadian government basically landed with helicopters on First Nation communities and scooped up kids and put them in residential schools where a lot of them died. And now they're finding these mass graves all around these schools. So I think maybe this is just my assumption, but in that conversation, it's hard for the Western world to kind of admit that there was that kind of genocide. So it's hard to not say one isn't better than the other. I think they want to look at both, but they also have a hard time saying we accept that maybe the Western ways of doing things isn't always right. Right.
And that's, I mean, to return to your point about how this could inspire future researchers, I think this is really important for us Westerners, the people who grew up in the West.
Yeah.
And again, to me, the West is more than a place. It's a project. It's like the Martinique poet Edouard Glissant would say, it's a project. It's an imperialist project.
Yeah.
But I think it's important for us who grew up in that kind of environment to challenge the system from within. And that's my positionality in the book. And that's why I'm not trying to provide other perspectives and to try to compare our approaches to disasters nowadays to other perspectives that may emerge. It's going to be the work of other people from these places. My positionality is to try to deconstruct the system from within, to try to show its flaws from within, because this is my own heritage, my own language, so I can unpack them from within. It's not my role at the moment to provide other perspectives.
It's almost like you've been in this field now for that amount of time where you're almost starting to disperse wisdom rather than information, in a sense. I don't know. I don't know if that's fair to say, but it is, because to be able to reflect back on a subject like disaster management or disaster risk reduction, with a worldly view, and then to kind of come out and start to talk about it in the way that you have in your book, like that's an imparting of wisdom now, right? For the next generation. That's where I see wisdom starting to coalesce.
But to be honest, I mean, I wrote that book, but there are many other people who feel the same.
Yeah.
And I mentioned early career researchers and younger researchers, but I'm not sure if your audience is aware of our Disaster Studies Manifesto and Disaster Studies Accord that we published in 2019 and then late last year for the Accord, which are all available from the Radix collective website, radixonline.org.
Okay.
Where we all came together. Yeah, radixonline.org. So it's the manifesto was initially a collective of 30 people who came together and wrote a manifesto to challenge these norms in disaster studies. And then the manifesto has been signed by 500 plus scholars from all around the world very quickly. And then since then, we came up with this accord late last year, which is more about practical guidelines to put the principles of the manifesto in practice.
Okay.
And we got it's still counting, but we got tens and maybe hundreds now of signatories as well. People who feel like there's an issue and many of these, I mean, have been much beyond my thinking in terms of theorizing this. There are fantastic young scholars all around the world at the moment who are doing fantastic work, including in Canada. And I think our role as more late career researchers, I still feel I'm young, but still, late career researchers is more to open up that space for these people to kind of build the confidence and be able to do something
Yeah.
different and see that we can do that in a different way.
Well, yeah, it's yeah, you have to transfer that knowledge somewhere again. So of course we don't continue to make the same mistakes or go through the same pitfalls, right? That only, makes things, it just things don't you won't see any change, and it's not sustainable when you keep making it. Not That's why I've got a friend here in Canada, Simon Wells. He started the Canadian Journal for Emergency Management.
Yeah, we saw that.
Oh, you saw that? Yeah. So that attempt again to transfer knowledge, create a centralized place for academia to meet, those who work on the ground and, the very operational people, the NGOs, governments, and all of that. So I think that's one way to do it, right? And so what was the make sure what was the website again for the manifesto?
Radix Online in one word, so RADIXONLINE.org.
Radix Online. Okay. I have not heard of that, so I will be oh yeah, home for radical interpretations of disasters and radical solutions.
It's a collective that emerged in 2001 under the leadership of Ben Wisner and Maureen Fordham.
Yep.
And
Okay.
it's long been an old website with a lot of archival material stored there, and a mailing list of, I think there may be thousands of followers on the mailing list.
Yeah.
And we revamped the website last year, relaunched it for the 20-year anniversary, and now
Okay.
we've got a Twitter account. So every week we have someone else tweeting on behalf of the account.
Oh, do you?
Um,
Okay.
and
Okay.
it's pretty active.
Yeah. Oh, and yeah, and you've got different languages. Okay, that's Radix. Okay, I'm following Radix on Twitter, so I came across it somewhere, but I'll have to pay more attention to it and check that out. That's cool.
This week, the account is handled by Daniel Rivera from, I think, UC Berkeley.
Okay, and so you kind of switch handlers on the social media
Yep,
just to
yep, every
just to
week.
keep. Oh, every week.
Yeah, every
Oh,
week.
okay, that's a good way to do it. Nobody's gotten into big trouble yet.
And there was a couple of weeks ago, a Turkish friend of mine based in Montreal at the moment who tweeted a bit about his work.
Okay, I'll have to in Montreal.
Yeah,
Okay,
he's based
I
in
will.
Montreal, yeah.
So
But
what are you?
he trained in Grenoble as well, like I did.
Oh, okay, same place.
So he's francophone and anglophone.
So what are you teaching at? So you're a professor of geography at the University of Auckland,
Yeah.
and so in the I guess in geography you mainly focus on disaster risk reduction. Is that are you
Yes,
teaching?
my personal undergraduate course is focusing on disasters, but my postgraduate course is focusing on participation.
Oh, okay,
Participation in development, people's participation in development at large.
okay, and I guess too, like, how do you say it? It's because I know you try to use uh, the indigenous language in New Zealand. What
Yep.
is the name of the university?
Waipapa Matarao.
Waipapa Tatarau. And that's
Taumatau. It's the new name actually of the university. There used to be another Reo Maori name until last year. They changed the name last year to
okay.
make it
So
more context specific.
okay, so there you okay. Awesome. Okay, so I'm trying to find where can people find your book? Rutledge.com. I know it's on there. Is it it's on Amazon?
Yeah, it's on Amazon. It's on all the usual online platforms. I think it was out of stock for Amazon.uk recently,
Okay.
but there should be some stocks with Routledge directly.
Yeah.
There are some. I don't want to make some promotions here, but there are some of these
Feel
platforms
free.
that do free delivery, so that's always better. And the book is very expensive. That's my concern. The printed copy is very expensive. It's a hardback, and that's the model that big publishers do now. It's about selling a large number or a number of copies of the hardback to eventually fund the publishing of the paperback.
Okay, I was gonna ask because yeah, it's 100. Yeah, it's over $100. You can
It's
get
very
a
expensive.
Kindle. You can get a digital version for
Yeah.
a price of a regular book, but eventually, then that hard copy will fund publishing of a paperback.
Yeah, and I heard recently that they've lined up the paperback for the end of the year, which I was very surprised with.
Oh wow.
Uh, so I think they've sold probably almost enough copies now for releasing a paperback version by the end of the year.
Yeah, okay, that's cool. Well, I mean, like go ahead and sell your book because I'm pushing it here in Canada because it's a very timely and relevant conversation, especially as Canada's going through this truth and reconciliation piece, and so many emergency managers and researchers here are focused on Indigenous knowledge sharing and starting to talk more to the local communities about, what was it like, even with the big floods in BC. So much discussion about the floods. That whole region had flooded, I think, 3 times before this year. It flooded back in the 1880s, early 1900s, again in 95. And of course, you don't hear about that, right? You only hear about the disaster today. And it was, of course, bigger because more people live there now. It's heavily populated. It's agricultural mecca for BC. But once you can look back 145 years, really, it's just a normal, it's just a normal thing that goes on in the geography of that area, right? Um, it's
Yeah,
just a
fair
blip.
enough.
Yeah, it's always going to happen, and I don't think there's much we can do to stop it at that magnitude. So, um, yeah, I really appreciate you doing this, taking your time. I think in New Zealand right now it's what, about 10 in the morning.
Yeah, it's almost
Not too
11, so
bad.
that's all right. That's not that bad.
Yeah, and I'm glad I'll be pushing your book out and
Thank
promoting
you.
this a little bit.
Thank you.
What's next for you? You've got part two coming up.
Yeah,
What is
so
some of the
part two, the sequel is going to be a sort of exploration of this otherness from the perspective of the place where I've spent most of my time in the Philippines, which is the Kapampangan region, which is north of Manila. So it's going to start with probably looking at obviously the local language, but as well folk tales and
Okay.
proverbs and traditional stories and early dictionaries by the Spaniards back in the 17th centuries and
Oh,
early
neat.
accounts by maybe Chinese traders previously, and yeah, and the pre-Hispanic script as well, which is being revived at the moment. So try to see in the script itself how we can maybe unpack some other views of what we call disaster, because we can't translate the word in the local language. I mean, we use calamidad in Spanish,
Yeah.
or we use puna, which is a Sanskrit word.
Okay.
So it's trying to use to use the language to unpack other perspectives.
Yeah, that's
Using art as well. Using arts hopefully as well.
art. Did you say art?
Yeah, local artists and artworks.
Yeah, and yeah, that is something that I think is lacking. What I've always said, and in Canada, we kind of use emergency management, disaster management interchangeably with disaster risk reduction. Nobody really knows what they want to land on in terms of terminology, but yeah, art, that sort of creativity is something that I know in Canada we're lacking. Using different art forms to sort of tell these stories and to teach others about what's gone on in the community over the last couple of decades, hundreds of years. I think there's a lot of opportunity there to do that, and I love that idea that you're looking at folklore and those stories to kind of create these. I don't know if the point is to create discussions or conversations, but or awareness around what the planet's gone through and what it's going to go through in the next 100 years. But um,
Probably not in this endeavor, but for example, next week I'm taking my undergrads to the dance slash drama studio to run a class which is going to be about embodying emotions in dealing
oh,
with hazards and disasters. So it's gonna be I shouldn't say dancing if some students are watching because that scares some off usually, but it's a
yeah,
drama
they don't
type.
want to dance. But is it kind of like and I'm just going to hazard a guess here, but is it kind of like you're getting the physical body in tune with the mental and the spiritual,
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe through meditation or mindfulness or just body movements, kind of like a Tai Chi.
Just body movement because it's very short. So it's about
Interesting.
engaging the body in space to actually feel and try to embody what a disaster maybe and emotions may affect your moves and your behaviors.
That is very cool. And is this something that you do specifically, or is this like where does that technique come from? Where have you been? What's the
We
back?
do,
Do you got
we do
time?
a
Are
lot
you
of
okay for time?
yeah, we do a lot of crazy things in this course, but no, yeah, I mean, I've got a he's not anymore my student now. He's graduated. He's got a PhD and he's teaching. But yeah, one of my closest colleagues now. He's a dancer and dance instructor, and he used to be competing very seriously with dancing. So
Okay.
we've been talking a lot about how we could use his own experience and skills
Wow.
in class and beyond class as well. I know I've got a colleague from dance studies here in Auckland who's been doing a lot of work with refugees in the Middle East,
Oh yeah.
using dance to, I believe, alleviate some of the stress and
Yeah.
struggles.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, I've got a Canadian colleague who's based in London. I'm not sure if you've talked to him, Ilan Kilman,
No.
who is doing a lot of work on performing arts as well in general.
Okay.
Um, I've got a student as well who's doing something on devised theater at the moment, trying to see how we can learn from devised theater to inform our work in the participatory space.
Yeah.
So it's
Awesome.
always trying to um, identify other ways of opening up a dialogue, whether it's through
Yep.
the body, through other forms of art, or whether it's through music, through video games, through anything that could open up a dialogue, through mapping, through very diverse tools, basically.
Yeah, that is really cool because that is going to be a big part of, the trauma that we're going to go through as a planet, as I think, we come out of the pandemic, and again, as communities start to see the impacts of climate change in their local areas, people are no longer going to be able to just deal with it or drink their way through it like they would have done 40 years ago. They are going to have to start to look at these different ways of managing the trauma and the grieving that goes beyond, I think, yeah, that Western science of you just go see a counselor, a psychologist, take this prescription, and you'll be good. Communities are going to need to embrace these art forms, and different ways of dealing with the trauma that they're going to start to experience. So that's awesome. I'm going to follow up on that and see. Uh, I got to talk to maybe someone that can, if you can give me someone to talk to about what you're doing in that would be cool. Or if there's other resources out there, because I think that's important.
I can surely recommend some people who would be more interesting to talk to than myself in that space.
Yeah, I won't ask you to dance right now, or
No, yeah,
do anything.
better for you, better for you.
Yeah, I'll do it. Awesome, man. Well, okay, I'll let you go. I again really appreciate. I could probably keep talking with you for a lot longer, but maybe we'll do this again. Uh,
Sure.
We'll do this again. We'll hook up again and have another conversation. But again, I really appreciate your time, sir.
No, I enjoyed it a lot, and thanks for having me.
Is it okay if I call you sir?
No,
Because
no,
I'm.
please,
It's
please
okay.
don't. No, no,
Yeah,
JC, JC.
yeah. I just had this conversation on LinkedIn about calling people sir and ma'am, and I shouldn't have used it, but I'm trying to get rid of that habit because I don't like being called sir. So now I ask everyone if I can call you sir.
Especially here in New Zealand, it's directly JC. Students would call you by your first name immediately at first encounter, so it's very laid back somehow. So that's
Yeah. Okay, that's good. And that I think that's part of that whole idea about getting to know the local community and the traditions so you can respect and all that. But
and
another
challenging
conversation.
hierarchies and norms.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. Okay. Well, JC, you take
No
care.
worries. You too. Stay
And
safe.
yeah, I will end this live